And she's saying, I only married him because I was also able to get a job. So it's like one step beyond the one who said, I would have gone to graduate school, but I dropped out because I got the ring. And the other one of the third generation says, so I got the 2 degrees. Bowling Green was one of the places that offered it, and I didn't want to stay in Youngstown, so it was either going to Miami or Bowling Green. But Miami didn't really have the program that I wanted. What she's doing is giving a long story of why she changed colleges and went to the college where her boyfriend was. But she says it by giving a whole long story about, okay, he was there, but I could go there and study what I wanted to study. So that's the women in 3 generations. Meanwhile, next subcategory says about the men. There's much less to say about the men. Unchanging ideologies concerning the roles of men. So the men in these 3 generations don't tell fundamentally different stories. First of all, none of them comment on the women's changing roles, so they're not really consciously aware of that. And all their vocabulary instead is what she calls, and I didn't write that on the board, yes, I wrote this word that the grandmother, at one point, one of the grandmothers said, well, in those days, in my day, a career woman wasn't something that was a good thing. Think of the term, career woman. Now that's the opposite of new words like has been. Who says career woman today? Because from the time when that was a thing. But you could never say career man, right? So the first generations, the grandmothers, are when they're the norm, and you're the weirdo, so you'd be a career woman. So they needed a word for that. Okay. So the men, instead what they talk about is self-actualizing vocabulary. That is, they talk about the degrees that they wanted to get, all the things you expect, without having to have, they didn't have to talk about the private part, in other words. And then she asked them about the private thing. Okay, but when did you meet your wife? And that's when they do the male hedging, that they can't really respond to the chronology. But there's one more big thing, and that is what is called orchestration. Then the next thing they ask them more about what happened when you met. And all the guys have to say something like here. Here is a couple, how the woman describes it, how they met, and how the guy describes it. This is the 2nd generation couple. She says, the same one who says, I didn't go to college to kill time. So I'll repeat that. Many of my friends had gone to college to kill time and look for husbands. I mean, I never considered that. I mean, I went to college. I intended to get a degree. The husband, the later husband, is interviewed, and he says, I saw Ellen, this woman, I saw Ellen at a party, and it was just like a chemical reaction occurs, and I felt, wow, look at that girl, I'm going to have this girl. Okay, and they call this orchestration. That is, over and over, I don't have time to read all the other examples. That when they describe it, she's describing it like Cinderella, I'm there, or I turned down his ring the first time, or I wasn't interested because I was going to go to graduate school, whereas he's always saying, I'm going to get me that girl. And again, just like, you can't turn around the gender roles. Think of a guy saying, well, I didn't go to college to find a woman, or I didn't go to college to find a wife. No guy would say that, because that's not a role that, even a negative role that you can have. And the same way a woman can say, well, I saw John at this party and I said, I'm going to catch that guy for my husband. Although a lot of women do that, but that's not something you can say, right? Yes?
I've heard men say the, I'm not in college to find a wife thing when a woman is trying to, if, they're kind of hanging out. This is happening to my roommate right now. She and this guy are have been hanging out for a while, and she wants to actually date him, and he's like, well, I'm not here to have a girlfriend or to find a wife right now. So I feel like it's just the press.
But he's using it in a different way. Yeah, very interesting, yes. Okay, so no more on that, but you should go look through the examples especially, because I'm reminding you that on the test I always have trouble finding examples for part 2. So it's important to do that. And I will just mention, in case anybody gets excited about this and wants to do a paper on this topic, these 2 other articles that I'm only going to say 2 words about. Where are they? These 2 here. This one by Zeitlin, also they're all from the 80s. It's called also The Family Courtship Story, but it's not about 3 generations. It's about how people make up retrospectively these things that, well, it was love at first sight and that kind of thing. And they have all sorts of examples here, how people, and they believe it after a time, they make up stories that some of which they got out of movie scenes and whatever, so they actually create, unknowingly somewhat, these very romantic stories. American family storytellers wax poetic when they tell narratives about family courtship, and they make up these very fancy stories, like, there are no stories, for example, after all, she says, of ambivalence at first sight. That's not a possibility. Oh, I saw him and I was ambivalent to him, but 6 months later we were married, right? You can't say that. And so they have all these wonderful stories, like, here, I'll just read this one, if I can find it. Well, there's one about how my grandparents in the Civil War or something, I couldn't have been the Civil War, actually, World War I. He was there as a soldier and she gave him something to drink and his hands touched hers, and 3 weeks later they were married, type of thing. So it becomes this grand romance, not only of your life, but it becomes family stories. By the way, immigration, it's not just courtship stories. Another one I always enjoy is when people tell me about, well, my grandmother or my great-grandmother came here from Poland or Italy or whatever, and they tell a totally ridiculous story of how it happened, where they don't know any of the details. And in fact, women by themselves almost never came by themselves. And if they did, it was a very negative reason why they came by themselves. But people don't know any of the historical background, and they've made these stereotypical stories. And then there's the other one by Reisman is very funny. It's now, after this marriage doesn't work, what do you have? You have divorce. So you need to have divorce stories. And this divorce stories, contrasting experience in marriage and narrative style, is a very interesting article. It contrasts 2 women. One is a waspy American middle-class white lady who says her marriage went bad because she had to do, her husband didn't give her emotional support, you know, companion marriage. And the other one is an immigrant woman from Puerto Rico, I believe. And she talks about, which we'll see when we have the unit on bilingualism, what happens in immigrant families in the new society, that her husband didn't want her to go out of the house at all to work, and he was very jealous, and he was controlling, and all these. So the stories are totally different, but not just the stories are different, the way they narrate the stories. The white woman narrates it in a very chronological, dry way. The other one narrates it in an emphatic way, with the main points being more important. So it's also very interesting. Okay, we have 5 more minutes, so I'll start Alexandra Georgopoulos about women, men, and conversational narratives in small stories or everyday talk, how they end up with different narrative worlds. Okay, so let's look at a few examples of this. She says, they did something like 30 hours of recorded conversation with 500 stories, and here are the various conclusions they came to from 500 stories. One was, regardless of the size and composition of the group, the mixed group, whether it was 2 people, a male and a female, or a mixed group, always there are more stories told by men than women, and the ratio is normally 2.5 stories for a man to 1 story for a woman. So in a party or in a marriage, the man talks 2.5 times what the woman talks. And what does the folk wisdom tell us?
Women talk more.
Women talk a lot, because it's against 0, and it's against if they have a public voice, and it's also against hearing women talk just to each other in a single sex group in an intimate, cooperative kind of way. And this figure of 2.5 to 1 keeps on getting increased, the difference, the more public the place is. So think of Monday's example of the Supreme Court justices who got interrupted by the male justices. And so interruption then becomes a way to keep that intact. So it's not just that it's 2.5 to 1 or 5 to 1 in Congress, let's say. It is that interruptions or silencing are then techniques essentially doing this to you, to keep you, to shut you up, to maintain that. And these are normal people, and not publicly important people. And she calls this verbal androcentrism. So that's the key word for this article. For all these statistics I'm going to give you, the key word that ties them together is verbal androcentrism, so that more rights to the males. And the males have these techniques that we saw on Monday to maintain those rights. You must think we're... Okay. Who cares, yes. Okay. Dialogue, as I mentioned in storytelling, when women tell stories, they have more dialogue. That is, they'll say, and then Jane said this, and Mary said that. They name more characters, they have more characters, and they say what they said. So what that means is that they construct a narrative world. That's part of that. In their stories, they actually look at those around them, not just, and then I broke the window and I got drunk and I got away with it. Those are quotes actually from a quotes article. Okay, male and female characters in stories. So my first statistic was 2.5 to 1 or higher difference for who talks. So the more public, the more the difference. Second statistic, male and female characters in stories. So now I'm telling a story and I'm a male. Or I'm a female. Okay, so if I'm a male, how many of my characters, what percentage of my characters are male? Just take a wild guess. Very good, 79.3, very good. Okay, you'll see it's actually worse, but that, yes, okay. So 80% are of the characters, but in real life, if the guy looks around, what percentage are male? Unless he's in a football team or it's 50-50 roughly, but it's 80, okay. Worse, well, okay, the others, how about now and how many female characters are there? There's 20% in his stories, and however, how many speaking characters or animated characters? So we have to make a distinction, okay? There's 80% males in the story, and 21% females. Now let's look at animated characters, that means who speak in the story. How many females? How many males first?
Out of the people who speak?
No, it has to be above 80, right? If they are, because at least 80. So how much above 80 is it? Yeah, 91. And how many females speak? 9%. Okay, so it gets, once it's speaking characters, and what's a speaking character? That's a human being. Right? Without a voice, they're just there. Now, to make it worse, you think that's bad, and our last example? How about in women's stories? Do we just take this and reverse it? Is it? No. So, how many male characters in women's stories? 73%. How many female characters? 27%. How many male characters speaking? It's here on a page, you don't have to. 77%. How many female characters? Well, at least there's 23% female speaking versus 9% in the other one. But this is what it means, that it's a verbal androcentrism. It doesn't just mean that we have a patriarchal society and we expect men to have more voice. What is worse here?
Is it some race?
Yes, and therefore you're doing the same thing, just a little bit less.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why this is very important. So animated character, and finally, just to finish this, the stories themselves are different, so that women's stories exhibit a pro-agreement ethos 50% of the time. That means that the story is about women doing things together, cooperatively, whereas in men's stories, almost half the stories are about some kind of conflict. So I saw this guy in a bar, and he insulted me, and I hit him, and I won, or that sort of thing, okay? So we'll continue a little bit with this. You don't have to read this, but it's instructive to look at some of the figures. So have a good rest of the week. We'll post the grades probably later tonight. And anybody who had problems will get a special letter explaining what you should do. And if there's... No, the paper was going to get back to you. You were here on Monday.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm gonna bring it this Monday. So for you, there are like 4 people who were in this Monday. I'm gonna give you that Monday.
Okay. Like next Monday?
Uh,
Wait, is that
yeah.
okay, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
Sunday.
I didn't really hear it.
So,
So remember, there's no section tomorrow. Everybody remembers there's no class tomorrow?